Hi everyone, welcome again to JOSPT Asks, the weekly chat where you, the audience, get your questions answered. I'm Clare, I'm the Editor-in-Chief of JOSPT, and it's great to be chatting with you again this week. Thanks for taking the time to join us, and thank you also for posting wonderful questions on Slido and for all of the feedback and the support that we're getting for JOSPT Asks. Today on JOSPT Asks, I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Emma Stokes. Emma's no stranger to the sports and orthopedics musculoskeletal rehabilitation community as president of the World Confederation for Physical Therapy, which incidentally is about to have a name change. So we might get the inside scoop on that a little bit later today. Emma's a passionate advocate for exercise and self-management as key pillars of good health, and she definitely practices what she preaches about taking care of one's physical health and mental health. Emma also helps to champion the role of women in our community, and I know that she is especially proud to lead the physiotherapy program at Qatar University, where she's helping to train the next generation of physiotherapy leaders in the Gulf region. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Emma on JOSPT Asks today to share her thoughts about the future of physiotherapy or physical therapy. So welcome to JOSPT Asks, Emma.
Oh, thanks, Claire. I'm delighted to be here. It's always wonderful to have time to chat with you.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to have you. And there's so many great things to discuss that I just can't wait to get started. So why don't we start with the hashtag Global PT? You use that quite a lot in your tweets. Who or what is Global PT?
So first of all, the hashtag Global PT arose out of a very early morning networking session in Singapore. Give a big shout out to Jared Green and Joe Milios, and then to Mark and Anne and Maria and Cecilia, who did some incredible work on the hashtag Global PT. But I think for me, Global PT is about signaling that the global community of physiotherapists is us. It's the global community that is made up of physiotherapists, members of the member organizations of WCPT, but recognizing that there are parts of the world where there may not be a physiotherapy member organization of WCPT. There may not even be a physiotherapy organization, a formal organization, and yet to me it's really important that as part of our our key our sort of top line strategic imperative is a global physiotherapy community where everyone feels connected and engaged. And of course I would sort of say I try often to say Global PT and the wider community, because of course we have so many champions, so many allies, so many colleagues that we collaborate with, that it's there are many of our fabulous supporters and collaborators and colleagues who are not physiotherapists who are part of the global physiotherapy community, in my view. So it's that wide concept of affiliation and belonging and engagement that, to me, that's when I use it, that's what I mean.
Now, our community is primarily sports and orthopedics. It's in our name. So I like to use the umbrella rehabilitation, musculoskeletal rehabilitation. How do you see sports and orthopedics or musculoskeletal rehabilitation fitting into that broad community of global PT?
So, I've actually, I've said this on many occasions, which is sports and orthopedic physiotherapy is often the way into the profession. If you speak to a lot of the first year students who come into physiotherapy, they come in because of sports, orthopedic physiotherapy. Now, some obviously do come in because perhaps they've had a family member who's had a stroke or Parkinson's, and that's been how they've perhaps interacted with the physiotherapist. But so many come in through that pathway, through that sort of modeling of the profession that they see in the sports physiotherapist or the orthopedic physiotherapist. So I would always say that physiotherapists who practice in the area of sports and orthopedic physiotherapy are, they are the gateway into our profession. And, you and that community have huge responsibility, because you are the people that model how these young people come into our profession. Now, they may never stay in sports physiotherapy, and that's okay, but you are often that way in. You are the people that they see on a day-to-day sort of basis. Whereas perhaps maybe more so now, perhaps after COVID-19, people will start to see the physiotherapists working in respiratory practice, maybe that's going to become more apparent, but really, that's who we see, so it's a very big responsibility, I would believe.
And then with responsibility comes important leadership challenges or leadership roles. So what are the key leadership qualities that you would like to see in the 2020s from Global PT, if we use that umbrella term for our community?
So I guess, look, I think, if you'd asked me that question 3 months ago, the answer might have been very different, but what are the leadership roles? So I think obviously inclusive leadership is really important. And it's something that has been, a really, I guess, a part of my leadership journey, certainly in the last 5 years, but particularly probably in the last, 2 or 3 years, around understanding what does that mean. And inclusive leadership means that no one gets left behind, right? But it's not a panacea to everything, but it is about recognizing that we need to be very intentional about being inclusive. I think for the sports and orthopedic community, it's about, so I think the sports community probably has a very strong self-identity, okay? And so there are key issues in sport that the community are going to have to look at, so for instance, what is the Olympic Games going to look like in a year's time? What is the World Cup in Qatar going to look like? What are, how is it that we work with, and when I say we, let's be quite clear, I don't work with athletes, but I collectively associate myself with our community, which is, what is working with professional athletes going to look like in the next, 6 months, a year, 18 months? What is that collective around sport going to look like? And how can we, what is it that we can do as a professional group, as a community, to demonstrate leadership? Where are the challenges and where are the ways that we can take those and turn them into opportunities? How is it that we need to look after the mental health of people? How is it that we start to work very closely around return to sport, whether it's return to sport in small children, whether it's return to sport in older adults, whether it's return to sport in, professional athletes have probably stayed in their training space, but the rest of the world has basically been in lockdown. So what does that look like? How do we come back from this, and how do we shape that new normal? How do we reimagine the profession? What were the things that we might have wanted to change 3 months ago that we now have the burning platform for? Because everyone's ability to embrace change, I think, has moved up a notch. So we have an opportunity to bring people on a journey far faster than we might have had, 3 months ago. How do we look at digital practice? What does that look like? How do we embrace that and not just sort of say, oh, it's just for now, because it's kind of a short-term solution to, a global pandemic. How do we say, right, how do we take that forward? So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I guess there is just so much opportunity in the midst of this, huge change. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to minimize the impact that this has had on individuals. I mean, people have lost friends and family members, and there has been, catastrophic consequences for older people living in residential care. Our communities in many parts of the world have been hugely challenged by this, and I don't even want to think what's going to happen in some of the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, and there's just so much that is catastrophic about this in terms of human lives. But recognizing that, I think it's also, if we were to talk about just the profession, it's an opportunity for us to embrace change in a way that is huge and is the biggest change that has happened in my 3 decades as a physiotherapist.
Yeah, and I guess the thing that really inspires me about that is that everyone can embrace change and everyone can take a leadership role. This is not just a thing that we leave to the people at the top. This is, everybody plays a role in this.
Absolutely. Leadership is not about being at the top. That's positional leadership. Leadership is about a mindset. Leadership is about seeing something that you think needs to change, and then being a positively disruptive force for change. I have no time for people who stand on the sidelines and just give out about things not being right. Come with a solution, get involved, be the change that you want to see, because it's very easy to stand on the sidelines and give out about things. That's just not helpful to anyone. It's like, write the second paragraph, stop talking to me in headlines. Just, where's your solution? What are you proposing? Because really, let's move on. I'm tired of people saying how things are not right in the profession and not coming up with solutions. And to me, this is the opportunity for solutions.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is too that sometimes we feel that we've got to be the only one to come up with the solution, and that's also not the case. It's leadership is about taking an opportunity and bringing people along with you, and I think again you've been a great role model for doing that.
And look, I think what's been fabulous in the last sort of 2 months is this, the idea that it doesn't have to be perfect to get it done, and so everyone is far more forgiving of something being good enough. And and like a classic example of this, I think, is some of the so WCPT has produced 2 briefing papers, and we've worked with this incredible group of people, one for the education, one for the one on rehabilitation. And you know what, I just think this is fabulous, because everyone has rolled up their sleeves. Everyone is forgiving of a bit of slippage. Everyone is forgiving of the fact that it's not perfect. And we have said these briefing papers are organic documents. They're out there. The briefing paper 1 around education might look quite different to briefing paper 4, in 6 months' time. So it's this idea that people are saying, yeah, there's an awful lot more self-compassion. There's an awful lot more compassion for, look, if it's good enough, let's get it out there. See how it lands. See where it takes us. And there's a confidence that no one expects perfection, and that's okay. And that's something that we need to hold on to, because I think, certainly as academics, and I think you and I would kind of probably recognize this, right? This idea that you're paralyzed because it's not perfect. Instead of saying, okay, look, do you know what? Let's just put it out there and see where it takes us. You can see it in the fast tracking of peer review. You can see how people are getting publications out there, and just, and look, there will be corrections. There'll be letters to the editor saying, it's not exactly, but you know what, not in a bad way, just in a, we recognize that you got this out there really fast. Could we draw your attention to the fact that this might not be completely accurate, and maybe you'd like to think about changing it or something like that. So I just think there's just a generosity of spirit and an ability for people to say, that's fantastic, let's run with it. That I just think is amazing. And I think let's not lose that, because I think it just, that allows for transformation and innovation, and this ability to be agile and nimble. And it's kind of like, everyone's working in a startup company, and we don't want the people, developing the vaccine to be kind of in that role. We want agility, but we do, as they were talking about at the WHO, at the WHO briefing yesterday, Mike Ryan was talking about this idea that, yeah, we want things to be fast, but we're not going to sort of let up on the quality end of things. And so that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, let's get the balance right, so that we can just change things.
Yeah, and I think we were probably due for a little bit of self-compassion, all of us. So it's probably a nice time to recognise that that's an important part of cutting ourselves a little bit of slack is also a really important way to boost creativity, to grow ourselves as leaders, to grow our community.
Absolutely. And I think, I think that's something that that's going to be one of the great things that's going to come out of this, yeah.
Now, you mentioned the briefing papers, and I'd like to pick up on the briefing papers and particularly talk about number 2, which has just been released. WCPT have just released briefing paper number 2, which is really how physiotherapy, physical therapy fits into a current COVID-19 world. Could you share with us some of the headlines and some of the important parts of that briefing document?
Yeah, and so look, I think one of the purposes of WCPT's briefing papers is recognizing that we have 120 member organizations. We have member organizations from all over the world. And so some of them are very well funded, very well resourced member organizations who are producing amazing content around COVID-19. And others are member organizations that are made up of people who have a very busy day job, and they do this in a volunteer way. So what we're trying to do is bring together what we see as being, published in the field at the moment, and producing sort of key messaging. So, recognizing, and this first briefing paper in rehabilitation is one of a second one that's going to follow up. So we're trying to keep them short so that people don't look at it and think it's 20 pages. I just don't think I got time to read it. So, we've directed people to resources around the acute management of people with COVID-19, but actually acknowledging some of the wider social issues and some of the issues around sort of an inclusive rehabilitation approach. So thinking our way through what happens to people who didn't have COVID-19, but were about to have a knee replacement. What happens to them? How do we highlight that these people should not be left behind? Recognizing that many people might have missed out on an opportunity to have a rehabilitation intervention that might have sort of produced the result that meant that they never had to have surgery. Or even if they had done that and were sort of lined up for surgery and were supposed to be doing their prehab or keeping themselves conditioned, what happened to them? Clearly recognizing that rehabilitation, as I said, is often under-resourced and underappreciated at the best of times. So now what's going to happen when we have to suddenly shift from a focus on the non-communicable diseases to the infectious disease that COVID-19 is? How do we start to look at the double burden of disease in high resource countries as opposed to the double burden of disease which we might have considered in other parts of the world? How do we think about that? How do we think about also the vulnerable groups of people who need rehabilitation all the time, because it's an ongoing part of their life? How do we think about the children with cerebral palsy or the teenagers with cerebral palsy or the people living with Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis or stroke? What happens to them? How does rehabilitation look in a world where we need to be physically distanced, where, what does that look like? Then we've got the people who are returning to work. So you've had people who perhaps were in quite sort of physically demanding jobs that were not at work for 2 months, who may not have been able to sort of stay on top of the fitness that they needed. But equally, what are we thinking about in terms of people's mental health? What's our role both in terms of the physical and mental health of our returning workforce? And also then, one of the pieces that was raised by Nikki Baker, one of my colleagues, was the idea that, the research would suggest that 1 in 10 people after viruses like Ebola and SARS develop a post-viral fatigue syndrome. And how are we folding that into the appropriate rehabilitation of people post this virus? What's that going to look like for people? Also, some of the sort of, that constellation of sort of effects of COVID-19, as they were saying at the WHO briefing yesterday, the larger the data set, the more we're starting to see these constellation of symptoms not being sort of little outliers. So, for instance, the fact that now a loss of sense of smell and taste has become one of the sort of cardinal symptoms, but it took quite a while for that to be recognized as being one that was actually not just an outlier, but actually something that's quite common. So I think we're going to find out more and more about what this post-viral is going to look like for people. The second paper is going to deal with vulnerable communities and fragile systems. And, I think we just need to be absolutely mindful of the fact that you and I live in places of privilege and resilience and resource. And we have lived in them wherever we have worked, I think, really, but what does this mean for vulnerable communities, whether they're vulnerable communities within high resource countries, so vulnerable communities like, for instance, the disproportionate number of people from BAME, so Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities that are dying as a result of COVID-19, but also what about fragile rehabilitation or health systems in some of the countries in the world, like for instance, in Africa and South America, where the system was fragile anyway, and now this could just tip it over. What are we thinking about in terms of Yemen, in Syria? What does this mean? Bangladesh and India has just had this, huge weather event. So just people living on the knife edge anyway. what does that mean for those communities? And how can we work at WCPT with our partners to start thinking about, what do we need to do to sort of help or support or create capacity? So that second paper is going to start to focus really on the vulnerable communities and the fragile systems. And we felt that needed a separate paper on its own, and for us to do a little bit more gathering of information from the community.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to reading paper number 2. I can certainly commend paper number 1, so the briefing paper that we've just been talking about rehabilitation in a current COVID-19 world. I really commend that paper to people. It's an excellent short summary, as you say, 10 pages, quick read, but not a quick read in the sense of it doesn't give you tangible information. That's what I really valued about it. It really gives you some great resource. Let's move to post-COVID-19, and some people are starting to think about this because there are some countries that are starting to open up slowly, and some are moving faster than others. But what are the opportunities that you see for physiotherapy, the profession of physiotherapy, in a post-COVID-19 world?
So if we start to think about return, reimagine, and reshape, which is sort of the model that we've been using, so the sort of respond, resilience, return, reimagine, reshape, which we borrowed and slightly quarter-turned from a McKinsey model. Thank you, McKinsey. It's this idea of how do we reimagine the profession? What does that look like in terms of practice, in terms of education? But maybe also what does it look like in terms of our collective engagement? And so I guess the answer is we don't know yet, right? So yes, some countries are emerging out of this, but they're emerging out of this in quite unique circumstances. So if you think about, say, Taiwan, that has done so brilliantly, they're emerging, but in a way, because of their response, because of what they learned from SARS, because of how they were able to respond as a society and as a collective to this, they are ahead of us in terms of understanding how things have changed. But then, so if you look at Australia and New Zealand, what does that look like in terms of lockdown? So for instance, New Zealand is at level 2 now, having gone from level 4 to level 3 to level 2. And I keep saying it's great that New Zealand are ahead of us because, from an education perspective, I'm like, you guys get back and just tell us what you've done, because the rest of us in the Northern Hemisphere are probably a little bit behind you. So just work it out for us and just tell us, So from an education perspective, I'm like, okay, let's just see how they're all managing it. And so I think practice has obviously shifted very significantly. So we've shifted very significantly to tele-rehab, digital practice. And I think what's been really interesting is how regulators and reimbursement models have moved. Now, some of those are in the temporary space. So I think we should be having the conversations, the conversations around what does that look like if this was the future? If this was a very embedded part of our practice, what does that mean for regulation? What does it mean for reimbursement? What does it mean for the digital divide? In other words, how can we ensure that if digital practice becomes embraced by us as a profession, and I think it will be, how do we make sure that that happens in an equitable way? How do we make sure that that's an inclusive part of our practice? So, how does that happen in places where there's no good bandwidth to support tele-rehab consultations? A tele-rehab consultation is not the same as a face-to-face consultation where you say, let's just have a look at will we talk about your blood pressure? Will we, so there's a difference. It's a much more granular, much different experience, and it may work for parts of our practice, but not for other parts of our practice. So the WCPT and Petra white paper on digital practice came out in March. There you go. How fabulous was that for timing? And it does give a great framework for asking the questions, which is, what do we need to think about? How do we think about privacy, confidentiality? But the complexities of culture, the complexities of patient expectations, the complexities of health literacy, it's not like flicking on a switch. Because if it was, we'd have been doing it 10 years ago. We'd have been doing it 20 years ago. It's not that simple. So I think we need to embrace it, but we need to do it in a very measured, intentional way that makes sure that it is done and that no one gets left behind. So we also have to start thinking about, what does practice look like in a physically distancing, PPE'd up world? You know, how do we make sure that the most vulnerable people, who often get left behind anyway, are not even further left behind because into innovative ways of practice that just create a greater divide. So for me, it's about how do we take a very social justice approach to our practice to ensure that vulnerable communities and vulnerable individuals do not get left behind in this time. And I think there's a risk that could happen. So I think it's how do we embrace the principles of social justice and health equity to make sure that this doesn't happen. I think what's been amazing. Oh, I should probably stop because
No, you can keep going. Keep going. What's been amazing?
What's been amazing is how we've, you know, I think we've really come together as a global community. I think, and I think what it has done is, in some ways, it's highlighted gaps. You know, ones where I suddenly think, oh, you know, I need to connect in a way better way with, say, education programs. For me, one of the things that's been on my radar is there are some fabulous education networks, and Wcpt has an education network, but I feel there are some people that are left behind in that one. And so today I was sending emails to, tormenting, I would say, the presidents of the member organizations in the Middle East and in the Africa region, saying, can you put me in touch with the people who are leading the physiotherapy programs in your country? Because I feel that, you know, I'm not sure that there's a network there, and I want to be sure that everyone is connected if they want to be connected, you know. So this was my afternoon's work. And so I think it's that idea that, you know, the education community have come together in a brilliant way. So WCPT, NFI, which is the European network, the network in South America, the networks that exist at CPDANS and ACAPT and the Canadian Alliance. I just don't want anyone to be left behind. So do we need to create another network that captures the rest of the world? Yes, we do. And that's our job. That's what we do. So I think there's been a generosity of spirit and a compassion and an ability to just recognize and be grateful for what we have, and recognize that, you know, as tough as it is for some of us and some people, that's like nothing compared to the hardship that other people are facing. So yeah, I think we have an opportunity to really grow exponentially. I think this is the opportunity. This is probably the biggest opportunity for change in the profession in our lifetimes.
Yeah, and I think for me, the other thing is that it's highlighted, or it's made me sort of reflect on this idea that we've now realized, you know, the challenge of not being connected, or the challenge of the digital divide, and we're in high income countries. These sorts of issues are challenges that people have lived with for many years in other parts of the world, and we've sort of not thought about it, and it's taken a pandemic for us to think about how our lives have changed, and we're still, you know, in a different situation than, say, perhaps others, but sort of that notion that things have changed dramatically for us, and in good ways and not so good ways, but we've got to bring people along with us, and perhaps it gives us some empathy or some compassion for others.
Absolutely, and some humility.
Your thoughts about education were great, because it segued me nicely into what I wanted to pick up on, and that was, you talked about the digital divide and changing practice. How do you, as an educator, a leader in education, build that into the teaching that you do with students at Qatar University?
Yeah, so look, Qatar University is just an amazing university, and when you get brought into a university and you're given effectively a blank sheet of paper and said, well, go for it, not design the curriculum that you want to design, and that's what they did. I mean, I am immensely grateful to the College of Health Sciences at Qatar University for the trust and the freedom that they have given us and at Clare University to design the program of the future. So, you know, I'd like to shout out to Lindsay Morris and Sean McAuliffe and Miriam Latrousse and Jeremy Lewis and Jennifer Hale, who are the current dream team. Jennifer at a distance, but she was with me last year working on the team to design the curriculum, and to the fantastic staff at the university. So what we've done is we've been able to take all of those ideas that we heard, you know, over the last 5 years about what physiotherapy education needs to look like and how it needs to look different, and we've been able to do that. So, and you know, then we had the kind of the few things that happened, the bumps in the road, where you suddenly think, oh, you know, we have no equipment. Well, it's really interesting. So we can't do anything because we can't actually, we've no beds, we've no goniometers, we've got nothing like that. So we had to change the first semester. You know what? We will never do it the way we planned to do it originally. We did nothing that, so for the first 8 weeks of the semester, students didn't put their hands on anyone because we didn't have anything for them to do. So we were focusing on a theme that we have called health and lived experience. Students all did health coaching. They learned about, you know, rehabilitation. So basically we were talking about critical inquiry and innovation. So they were able to critically appraise a randomized control trial. They were looking at quantitative research methods in the first semester. So what we are creating are critical thinkers. We are creating critical, you know, the next generation of physiotherapists will need to be able to critically think their way through pretty much anything. And you know, we're not covering everything by any means, you know, but what we are creating are these, you know, these thinkers that are able to say, oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard about that, but let me just think about it. So very focused on the biopsychosocial model. They had the most incredible course on pain, you know, like a really, really dive deep into pain. And, you know, look, we're really lucky because, you know, we had Jenny Setchell and we had Maxi Mitchek and we had Pete Moore and we had Laura Finucane and we had Jill Cook. Like, you know, our students are getting the world's best minds. Karim Khan came in and gave them a talk, you know, so they are getting people coming in, and they were getting them coming in on Zoom. So they were completely used to Zoom. So our approach is about empowering change and health behavior change, but also embracing the fact that there are these very significant aspects to the lives that we live, to the beliefs that we have, that we bring to our interaction with the physiotherapist. And so really embedding those beliefs and those thoughts and that critical thinking right from it. So this idea that how important health education and health literacy is, all of that, front loading that so that the students are incredibly, you know, they don't know that there is any other way of thinking about physiotherapy, which is really fascinating because, you know, they don't realize that there are a lot of people out there that think about it in a very different way. And so just, yeah, it's just such a privilege to work with a group of amazing young women as well. And then for me, I think, and for us as a team to be immersed in a very different part of the world. So I'm living in Qatar. And recognizing that, you know, I come from a very Western worldview, you know, so I grew up in a predominantly Catholic country. So I have in my upbringing and in the worlds that I have lived in a very particular view. And now I am immersed in a very different view of the world. There are different worldviews. And I think, you know, so when we were talking about ethics, we were talking about the principles of bioethics. And I had a fabulous session with the students where we talked about, help me understand what Islam tells us about ethics and how do we take the principles of Islam and the four principles of bioethics, and help me understand through an Islamic framework how that applies in practice. And, you know, the students are fantastic because they basically taught me. And, you know, that's the richness of this experience. We're very low on power in our program. So we very intentional about how our rooms are set up. So we're very intentional about sort of the very low power, the idea that we bring a series of principles to our educational philosophy, which is the idea that, you know, you learn from everywhere, that that everyone is an expert in a different way, that we're all learners and teachers. And so we have a series of guiding principles that we front load at the front of every lecture to remind everyone that this will potentially be an uncomfortable journey, but it should be filled with joy, and that it's okay for it to be uncomfortable. It'll get easier. So yeah, I guess I'm not sure if that answered the question, but yeah, so it's a very different approach in many ways, but it's fabulous.
Yeah, lovely. I would love to be a student again. um, So one of the questions that came through on Slido was about the biopsychosocial model. So I'm glad you picked up on that. And how do the students, what's been your observations about how the students go when they go out into practice and perhaps start to realize that not everybody has been trained in this way that they have been learning? And how do we, if we accept that a biopsychosocial model, or perhaps a broader view of what health is rather than forcing it into a biopsychosocial model, how do we bring that to our broader physiotherapy practice?
Yes, and so I suppose when you've got a theme that runs through your course called Health, the Lived Experience, you're putting it front and center, that health is a lived experience, and that, it is that idea that we have lives, we have families, we have our religion, we have our culture, we have our the way that we learned about pain in our family, the way that we learned about illness in our family, our cultural beliefs. And of course, Clare is a very multicultural society. So what we did was this semester, we started this idea of a theatre of learning. So we had 1 day a week, which was a theatre of learning. And so the students went out in practice. And I guess I think if we take the view that every patient is a person and they're a human being, and if we stay focused on that person, and so Maxi Micek's work around the Therapeutic Alliance and the conditions for engagement is it's stunning work, and it's very accessible. And what's really interesting was we worked with the students on that, and then Maxi came and did a workshop with them, and then they sieved their practice experience through that. So sure, they saw places when it was embraced fully, where the person was embraced in their wholeness and in their richness and in their the sort of the beautiful richness that is a person that comes to a physiotherapy consultation. And they recognized that there are many barriers to that, and it might not be the biopsychosocial model, the physio hasn't been taught that or doesn't practice it that way. It might just simply be they don't have enough time to be with that person, or the system issues challenge it. So I think as long as we hold on to the fact that the person is the center of everything that we do, then we can't stay focused on the knee, because the knee is connected to a whole pile of other things. It's a person with their story, and so I think we place a lot of emphasis on storytelling and narrative as well. And so I guess what they started to observe was different practices. But our job is to recognize that everyone that they work with is coming from the best place that they can be in. And this is not about being critical of anybody else's practice, but it is about how do we enable them to model it differently.
I want to move us to speaking about diversity and inclusion. And we've had some great discussions. I'm very fortunate to have had some great discussions with you about this. The journal Nature, today or yesterday, has warned that women academics are posting fewer preprints and starting fewer research projects than their male peers during the COVID-19 pandemic. What's your response to that?
Yeah, so slightly tongue-in-cheek, it took a paper in Nature for us to actually realize that. Because yes, why does it surprise anyone? Because if you think about it is very hard for women, not just in the academic community, but in many, many walks of life, to achieve the same outputs as their male colleagues at the same stage and with the same opportunities. And that is a huge challenge. And then you drop COVID-19 on top of that, and you look at the burden of the additional responsibilities that women take on, or that are placed upon women, when it comes to normal, let's call the world normal life, whatever that ever was. And then you throw in a global pandemic, and that just becomes heightened, it becomes amplified. So the disparity becomes even more amplified. And so I think, you know, it's both a systemic issue, like it's an organizational, institutional issue. And that has a lot of things that need to be addressed. And so sometimes I think as men and women in our community, you suddenly think, oh, this is such a big problem. How can we do anything about it? You know, what do we do? And of course, we are attentive to everything that we can be around institutional policies. But as individuals, if we are in leadership roles as men or women, our job is to make sure that that does not happen in our teams. And to not be complacent about it, but to be super intentional about it, and to check in and to ask and to make sure that we are not choosing to give the male member of our team more opportunity because it might be just easier for him to be asked to do it, instead of saying to the woman on our team who might have, you know, a lot going on in terms of perhaps childcare issues, saying, you know, what is it that would enable this? How can I ensure that you are able to do this and get as much opportunity as the male members in this department? And I don't know that I have got that right all along, but I hope that I am asking the right questions to make sure that if I'm not providing the support that's needed or the opportunities that are needed, that that I'm careful about it. So, you know, simple things like checking in with someone so for instance, homeschooling at the moment, you know, it's like, that is just, I can't imagine. Like, I look at my two nieces, Sarah and Louise. Hello. I know I was supposed to say hello to you earlier in the conversation. If you're watching this, you should be in bed. But if you're not, I'm delighted that you're sitting up. This is what I do in my day job. But, you know, like, I look at the homeschooling two children or homeschooling, you know, small children it's just this huge extra thing. So I suppose my question would be, how are heads of department, how are people in leadership roles ensuring that this does not happen? You know, what are we doing to make sure that we are ensuring that the playing field is fairly even? And I don't know what the answers are because I think they're quite individual.
So then in physiotherapy more broadly, so that was a bit on the research academia side, but what are the biggest barriers that you see, or the biggest diversity and inclusion challenges that you see in the physiotherapy world or physiotherapy practice?
So I guess one of the things that I'm really curious about is the extent to which we understand the different perspectives in our practice. So, WCPT will be launching a project next week, which is, or if it's not next week, it'll be early the week after next, which is it's going to be called The First Rough Draft of History. And we are going to be gathering stories from around the world in different languages, asking physiotherapists how COVID-19 has changed or is likely to change the practice of physiotherapy. And I think this is probably the first history project that will be asked and information will be gathered in languages that are diverse. And if you look at the histories of physiotherapy and how they have been written by one particular worldview. And I think it's time that we start seeing other perspectives. So as I said, you know, I'm living in Qatar now, and I've spent a year with an amazingly fabulous group of students who don't see themselves in a lot of the images that we have of physiotherapy. And there's very little written about the contribution to, from the cultures in the world that I live in now to the profession. And I have these conversations with Dave Nichols, and he would acknowledge that in his book, The End of Physiotherapy, which is, we need to be embracing the stories of parts of the world, of languages that we don't speak. And it shouldn't be okay just because we don't speak them to not have those histories. So first of all, to me, that is a fundamental challenge for us, which is that our history has been written by a very particular worldview, a very Western worldview, and a very particular, high resource worldview. So that's the first big picture. How do we look at the world differently? If you look at the diversity and inclusion challenges just in terms of organizations, member organizations of WCPT, we go from, parts of the world where there are just so few physiotherapists and enormous need, and people working 3 jobs and then trying to run an organization. And I just think sometimes, I don't know how people do it. I really don't. I'm filled with admiration and awe of my colleagues around the world, and their capacity to develop the profession. And that's a huge issue. That's a huge issue. And so, we need to create ways to ensure that all voices are heard. So I guess, when you set up a committee, or you develop a working group, or you develop a task force, or you start to write a paper, pause, ask the question, whose voice is not here? And then make sure that voice is heard, make sure that voice is in the room. Go and find that voice, and don't start without them. Don't say, should we come back to it now in 6 months' time? We just get started and we'd see, and we won't forget, we'll bring them in. Don't start without them. Don't start without the voices that are missing, whether they're gender voices, whether they're culturally for different perspective voices, whether they're voices that are, if it's a multidisciplinary project, are there professional voices that are missing? Whether are they voices from low, middle, high income countries? Where are the voices that are missing? Ask about those voices, because if they're not in the room right from the beginning, then you shouldn't start the project. That to me is the issue. And then, even in high income countries, in high resource countries that hold themselves up as these, champions of, high quality healthcare, look at what COVID-19 has revealed. It has revealed inequities. It has revealed injustices. It has revealed communities that are just disempowered, that are treated badly. And that's in the high resource countries, where that should never happen. It shouldn't happen anyway. But there are vulnerable groups in communities all over the world. And I suppose for me, that's where diversity and inclusion comes from. And look, if it was easy, there wouldn't be a problem, right? If this was easy, everyone would be doing it right. So when we think about diversity and inclusion, we have to think about the fact that every time we make a decision, someone is going to be advantaged and someone is going to be disadvantaged. And this is not binary. And as I say, the air is thin on the high moral ground, because it is very easy to stand in judgment on the decisions that are made by people, or the choices that people make about where they put their resources. And it's nuanced and it's hard, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. That there are so many resources, there are so many great ways of doing this. And now more than ever, we are going to have to embrace the challenges of living and breathing and enacting the diversity and inclusion belief and message.
I want to talk a little bit about evidence-based practice. And I think it ties into what we've just been talking about with diversity and inclusion, because I think everyone in our community gets evidence-based practice is important, and we need to be practicing in an evidence-based way. But one of the challenges to practicing in an evidence-based way is resources. So how can people from high resource countries support their colleagues who are in, say, middle or low resource countries to foster this evidence-based practice model that we're all trying so hard to work in?
Yeah, so evidence-based practice, as we know, is a triad, right? It's both, it's the research, it's the best available research, given everything that we know. It's the beliefs of the person, their values, their belief systems, their expectations, and it's the practice experience. And so and I think when we talk about evidence-based practice and access to evidence-based practice, we often focus on that one part of it, which is the how do we access the latest research, the best evidence, the best research evidence. And what we have to recognize is, patient values and beliefs can be accepted wherever you are in the world. That's just a mindset. That's about recognizing that this person comes to me with their story and their life and everything, and how do I embrace that? And the patient, the clinical experience is something that people gather over the time that they're practicing, and that shouldn't be different. Your practice will be different wherever you are in the world, but you may have a far greater practice experience in a low resource country where you have a scope of practice that is, way greater than, a nice narrow staff grade job in a high resource country. So if we're talking about the research piece, then addressing that's where we have to start thinking about making sure that the research is happening in a way that means that it's relevant to the practice of someone in this particular part of the world. But also, how do we create accessible interpretations of research? So, Physiopedia Plus, fabulous community, JOSPT, BJSM, sort of communities that create content that is, taking the research and then saying, okay, this is what it means, having these conversations, sort of not just having a conversation with me, but when a research paper comes out, bringing 3 or 4 different people from all different parts of the world and saying, okay, look, we're talking about reframing, this piece that we did this time last year in Geneva around reframing musculoskeletal practice. And, we didn't just talk about it from a high income country. We talked about it. We made sure that people that were part of that conversation were from different parts of the world. That's how you do it. You say, this is a piece of research, let's not go down the whole rabbit hole of open access and, the whole business model of journals, but how do we make sure that we create content that is both available, but then how do we apply it culturally? How do we apply it locally? How do we enable that to happen? How do we create good knowledge transfer portals that don't require the person to do, how do we make sure that clinical guidelines that are developed in a high resource country can be contextualized? What are the tools that allow people to contextualize it? And WCPT's role, potentially around, our new website and sort of starting to develop our space as a knowledge hub, which is how do we work with JOSPT, BJSM? How do we work with Physiopedia Plus? How do we work with our member organizations to make sure that we don't create the content, but that we enable it to be accessible around the world in ways that are meaningful for physiotherapists in their day-to-day practice?
Yeah, and this is certainly something that journals are aware of too. And we all get that we work in a quite narrow journal model at the moment. That's changing, and there are some people who are doing fantastic work at getting information out there for free that doesn't require a subscription. Blogs and podcasts and infographics and lots of things are going on that don't necessarily require someone to pay for a subscription.
This is a classic example of, and well done, Clare, and well done, JOSPT. This is a brilliant way. You've had incredible speakers who will be far more relevant to day-to-day practice than I will be, but like in the last couple of weeks, you've had Kieran O'Sullivan, you've had Jeremy Lewis, like people who will actually be able to, so listening to their interviews with you, they were answering questions from people all over the world. That person had that information to go the next day and say, right, okay, so I heard about that research that Kieran was talking about in terms of, pain and conversations around pain, and Jeremy was talking about in terms of shoulder. That's what makes it accessible. This type of interaction is what makes it accessible. I'm not going to change someone's practice tomorrow. I really haven't, and I'm very aware of that. But those type of, and the ones that you're planning over the next few weeks and in the next couple of months, big shout out. There's going to be fabulous content coming down the track that would be really brilliant in terms of enabling the research to change practice the next day.
So in our last 7 minutes, let's talk a little bit about your leadership roles. So what are the most fulfilling parts of being the president of WCPT?
Oh, yes. I should have thought about this. I get to spend time with the best of our profession. And when I say the best, I don't mean, I get to spend time with the leading researchers. I get to spend time with the presidents of member organizations. That's not what I mean. I get to spend time with everything that is good and right and brilliant in our profession. And I think I get to meet people from all over the world, and I get to learn about how incredibly dedicated and courageous people are, and how committed they are to their patients and their communities. And I've had that privilege for 5 years, and that's probably the piece that is absolutely fabulous. I love the work that I do within the organization with the board. We have an amazing secretariat, a brilliant team of people. I just get to. Stacey DeGale is one of our board members, and she said, I was asking a question a couple of years ago, why do we need a global organization? And Stacey said, because we get to harness the world's best talent. And that is it. It's like, I just get to meet and spend time with fabulous people in our profession all over the world. And, when I come to the end of my time as president, I hope that I will be able to look back and think, yeah, I made a small mark on that profession. I made a small mark on the global community somewhere along the way, through a conversation that I had, or the work that we did collectively as the board and as the staff and as a global community. We moved the profession forward, and we supported and we encouraged, and I think that must be it for me. It's just, I'm so proud of our professional community. I just think it's filled with incredibly fabulous people. I guess spend time with them. So what's not to love about that?
Nothing at all. How can folks get involved with WCPT?
So WCPT is a confederation of member organizations. So look, there's loads of ways to get involved, but the first thing that I say to people is become a member of your member organization in your country. There is no excuse, really. And don't be telling me that they don't do enough for you. Because if you think they don't do enough for you, just become a member and start changing it. Because I just find this transactional relationship with professional organizations is something I just find it so hard to understand. And I try hard. It's not like I haven't tried to put myself in that person's shoes. It's just, I just can't get in there. And just, it just doesn't work for me. So that's the first thing. If you are a member of your professional organization, or if you're in a country where there isn't a professional organization, contact us, because we can help you grow one, and we can help the one that's in the country become a member. So there's the DOVS database, which is our database of volunteers and experts. So become a WCPT Dove. It's an open-facing one. Obviously that's where we find our technical experts. So if WHO asks us for a technical expert, we say, oh, let's just check the DOVS database, or we go to our subgroups in our networks. And, that would be, so our subgroups, we have 25 subgroups and networks. And, I found the Musculoskeletal group. That's obviously one of them. The sports group, the International Federation of Sports Physiotherapists is another one, which your community might be members of in their own countries. So in their member organizations. So join that way. If that's your pathway in, find your joy and come in that way. We have great social media channels, and we have a very, very beautiful new website that's going to go live in June. Just stunningly beautiful in its new rebrand, but also much greater capacity. So whatever about the beauty, it's got actually greater functionality, greater capacity for us to do more and to support more. So Twitter, Facebook. Many of our subgroups have Facebook groups, so you can join those as individuals. So come to Congress, come to our subgroups congresses, go to our member organizations congresses, listen to the conversations, just roll up your sleeves and find a way to be involved. And I guess the way I got involved was by volunteering. So just make yourself indispensable to somebody in your global community and, volunteer, offer to do something.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way of finding lots of other really interesting people in the community to connect with as well. Absolutely. So it's definitely a two-way thing here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let's finish. I'd like you to share with us how you've been keeping active in body and mind during COVID-19 lockdown.
With great difficulty. I'd like to say it was easy, but no, it's been fine. So so when I live in Doha, I work out in the gym and I swim, and I'll put my hand up and say, I don't get to the gym easily, so I need help to get to the gym. So so I either work out with a friend, or I actually have a personal trainer who I work out with as well. sorry, I acknowledge that that is a very, very privileged place to be, but I have a nasty hip. So I am exercising my way from surgery. So I have a fabulous physiotherapist here who's got me over the line, Ruth McGee, in relation to that. So here I've been walking. And then to add an extra load, I put 10 kilos into a rucksack, and I've been walking with that on my shoulders, much to my parents' consternation, who think, what are you doing with a rucksack with 10 kilos in it? And then I do a lot of just, body weights, press ups, triceps dips, just, there's 60 kilos of me that I can push and pull in a variety of different ways. And that's what I've been doing. I have tried the trampoline in the garden, which was not my finest moment. My nieces decided it would be fun to see me on the trampoline. And I did have quite a bit of soreness after that. And then, from a mental health perspective, I try to meditate every day. I've tried hard. I bring what I can to my meditation every day. I don't do it for longer than 10 minutes. I spend time with friends on Zoom, and that's been great. And I'm taking a week off tomorrow. And I have to say, I'm facing into that week with great anxiety, because I don't know what I'm going to do with the week. So it's going to be a challenge, but let's wait and see what happens. So I'm going to try and disconnect from social media for the week, disconnect from email from the week, and read books, actual books, not digital books, paper books. Yeah.
Fantastic, Emma. That sounds great. And I hope that week off is a relaxing, restorative, regenerating, rejuvenating, all the R words, good time.
So if anyone sees me on Twitter next week, tell me to get off. What are you doing? You said you were taking a week off.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Emma. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's just been fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.